Picture a clay tablet about the size of your palm. It's been sitting on a desk in a coastal city for 3,000 years, waiting to be read. The city is Ugarit on the Syrian coast. The year, give or take a decade, is 1190 BC. The tablet is a message, pressed into wet clay by a scribe who almost certainly knew something was wrong. The letters are cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks that, if you learned to read them, would spell out something like an emergency alert. The king of Ugarit was writing to a neighboring ruler. His fleet was far away. His army was somewhere it shouldn't be. Ships had been spotted offshore. Enemy ships, lots of them, moving in a way that meant nothing good. The king needed help. He pressed his stylus into the clay. He handed it to a messenger. We don't know if the message ever arrived. We don't know if the messenger survived the next 48 hours. What we do know is this: the tablet was found in the ruins of Ugarit's palace, still unbaked, still in its original room, preserved by the fire that destroyed the building around it. The last message from one of the ancient world's greatest cities was baked into permanence by the same catastrophe that ended it. Ugarit didn't just burn, it vanished. A port city that had stood for over 1,000 years, a city whose harbor welcomed ships from Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, and Mesopotamia, a city whose warehouses held goods from 3 continents. It burned sometime around 1190 BC and was never rebuilt. Its name didn't appear in historical records again for 3,000 years. But here's what makes that tablet more than a tragedy. It wasn't just the last message from one city. It was the last packet in a network that, at its peak, was the most sophisticated thing human civilization had ever built. A network that stretched from the tin mines of Afghanistan to the copper islands of Cyprus to the palace archives of Greece. A network held together not by fiber-optic cables or digital signals, but by clay tablets and diplomatic marriages and merchant ships and a metal alloy called bronze. A network that functioned astonishingly well for 3 centuries, and then failed almost completely within the span of a single human lifetime. This is the story of the Bronze Age Internet, how it worked, why it was fragile in exactly the same way our modern systems are fragile, and what the silence after its collapse can tell us about the noise we live inside right now. Turn down the lights. Let's go back to the beginning. On a summer day in 1982, a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Kakir was working the seafloor off the coast of Uluburun, near the modern resort town of Kos. He was doing what sponge divers do, scanning the rocky bottom for commercial sponges, moving slowly through the blue-green water, not thinking about archaeology. Then he saw something. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. Flat, yellowish ingots stacked in rows on the seafloor. Dozens of them. Each one shaped like a stretched animal hide, with 4 handles at the corners. They were copper, 10 tons of it, piled on the bottom of the Mediterranean like someone had simply set it down and not come back. Kakir surfaced, told the authorities, and set in motion one of the most significant underwater excavations in history. What archaeologists found over the next 11 years of diving was this: the wreck of a merchant vessel, approximately 50 feet long, that had sunk sometime around 1300 BC. The ship itself had disintegrated, consumed by sea and time. But its cargo was still there, spread across the seafloor in a shape that preserved the ghost of its original stacking. And that cargo was, in a word, impossible. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin, probably from Afghanistan, though the exact source is still debated. Glass ingots in 4 colors, cobalt blue, turquoise, purple, and amber, from workshops in Mesopotamia or Egypt, Canaanite jewelry, Egyptian scarabs, Mycenaean pottery, African ebony, Baltic amber, terebinth resin from the Levant, a substance used for incense and medicine, pomegranates, figs, olives, spices, weapons, tools. In total, goods from at least 7 distinct cultural regions, packed into a single wooden ship about as long as a city bus. Archaeologists called it the richest Bronze Age shipwreck ever found, which is technically accurate, but misses the point. The Uluburun wreck isn't remarkable because it was rich. It's remarkable because of what it represents. This wasn't a diplomatic gift ship. It wasn't some special royal cargo fleet. Everything the evidence suggests points to this being a routine commercial voyage. One ship, making its regular run along established trade routes, carrying the standard mix of goods that circulated constantly through the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. Routine, standard, regular. Which means there were hundreds of ships like it, maybe thousands, making similar journeys every single year. Moving copper from Cyprus to Greece, tin from Afghanistan to Egypt, finished goods bouncing between ports in a constant circulation of materials that kept the entire Bronze Age economy running. When archaeologists talk about the Bronze Age trade network, they're describing something abstract: routes, hubs, exchange systems. The Uluburun wreck makes it concrete. It's a snapshot, a frozen moment, a hard drive that crashed to the seafloor and survived, improbably, for 3,300 years. And when you stare at the cargo manifest, when you really sit with what was on that ship and where each item came from, something starts to feel familiar, uncomfortable, modern. This wasn't primitive. This was a supply chain. Baltic amber, harvested on the shores of what is now Denmark or Poland, carried south through Central Europe by a chain of middlemen, loaded onto a Mediterranean ship, bound for buyers in Cyprus or Egypt. The amber traveled roughly 2,000 miles before it reached that ship. And that was just the last leg. Tin from Afghanistan, mined in the mountains of what is now northeastern Iran or Afghanistan, traded westward through Mesopotamia, loaded onto ships in ports along the Levantine coast, distributed throughout the Mediterranean. Tin didn't just happen to show up in Bronze Age workshops. It was systematically extracted, packaged, traded, and shipped across 3,000 miles of overland and maritime routes, year after year, for centuries. The Uluburun wreck is a node, a single point in a network of extraordinary complexity. And like any network, you can't understand the node without understanding the system it was part of. So, let's talk about the system. Let's talk about why the Bronze Age needed a global trade network in the first place, and why the answer to that question is buried in the chemistry of an alloy. Everything starts with bronze, not as a metaphor. Literally. The Bronze Age is called that because bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the defining technology of the era. the material that made civilization as the ancient world understood it possible. But here's what most people don't learn in school. Bronze isn't just a harder version of copper. It's a fundamentally different material that requires fundamentally different inputs, and those inputs, by an accident of geology, were almost never found in the same place. Copper, by itself, is too soft for serious tools or weapons. A copper sword will bend and deform on impact. A copper plow tip will wear down after a few seasons. For decorative work or basic implements, copper is fine. But for the things that matter, military power, agricultural productivity, the industrial backbone of a civilization, pure copper doesn't cut it. Literally. Add tin, though. Add tin in the right proportion, roughly 10 to 15% of the total mix, and something remarkable happens. The alloy becomes harder than either metal alone. It holds an edge. It can be cast into complex shapes and then worked further. It resists corrosion. Bronze weapons can penetrate bronze armor. Bronze tools can clear a field, build a palace, outfit an army. Bronze was the steel of the ancient world, the material that separated organized states from everyone else. Now here's the problem. Copper deposits are geologically common. Cyprus had massive copper mines, so much copper that the island essentially gave the metal its name, cuprum in Latin, from Kypros. Anatolia had copper. The Sinai Peninsula had copper. Parts of what is now Italy had copper. Copper wasn't abundant everywhere, but it was available enough that a well-organized state could usually find it within a manageable distance. Tin is different. Tin is frustratingly, almost maliciously rare. The major tin sources in the ancient Old World were scattered across vast distances. The Erzgebirge Mountains on the modern German-Czech border, possibly Cornwall in Britain, the Taurus Mountains of southern Anatolia in small quantities, and, most importantly, most abundantly, the mountains of Afghanistan and possibly Central Asia. Let that sink in. The tin that Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations needed to make their weapons, their tools, their everything, a significant portion of it came from mines that were literally on the other side of the known world. 3,000 miles from Egypt, 2,000 miles from Greece. Thousands of miles of mountains, deserts, river valleys, and political boundaries, all of which had to be navigated, negotiated, and paid for every single year. This wasn't optional. Bronze wasn't a luxury. You could live without lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. You could skip the Baltic amber. You could decide that purple dye from Phoenicia was an extravagance and wear undyed linen. But without bronze, you couldn't maintain your army. Without your army, you couldn't defend your borders. Without your borders, you weren't a state anymore. Bronze was infrastructure. Bronze was power. Bronze was survival. Which meant tin was survival. Which meant the trade routes that moved tin were survival. Think about what this created. Egypt, one of the most self-sufficient civilizations in the ancient world, with its own copper sources in the Sinai and its own gold mines in Nubia, still needed to import tin. The Hittites, who controlled large parts of Anatolia, still needed copper from Cyprus and tin from somewhere far to the east. Mycenaean Greece had neither copper nor tin in sufficient quantities and depended entirely on trade for both. Every major Bronze Age civilization was structurally dependent on trade networks they didn't control, moving materials through territories they didn't own, relying on relationships with distant peoples they only partially understood. This is the foundation of what made the Bronze Age world so sophisticated and so fragile. The chemistry of an alloy forced interdependence at a scale that the ancient world had never seen before. And into that forced interdependence, something extraordinary grew. Not just trade routes, but a whole system, diplomatic, commercial, and communicative, that linked the great powers of the ancient world into something that functioned in ways that should feel familiar, like a network. The Bronze Age Internet wasn't designed by anyone. It emerged from necessity. It was built not by visionaries, but by merchants who needed tin, and kings who needed armies, and scribes who needed to document everything. But once it existed, it worked with a sophistication that still startles historians when they look at the evidence. And the evidence is remarkable. The evidence is thousands of clay tablets, letters between kings, diplomatic correspondence that reads like emails between heads of state. The ancient world had a server, and the records of that server survived. In 1887, an Egyptian woman digging in the ruins of a site called Tel El Amarna found something that would change how historians understood the ancient world. She found clay tablets, lots of them, tablets covered in cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing of Mesopotamia, which was strange because this was Egypt. Word got out. Local antiquities dealers started buying tablets. Museums started buying from dealers. Eventually, professional archaeologists arrived and began systematic excavation. By the time the dust settled, roughly 382 tablets had been recovered and distributed among museums in Cairo, Berlin, London, Oxford, and elsewhere. They are known collectively as the Amarna letters. And they are, in terms of what they reveal about the ancient world, one of the most astonishing discoveries ever made. The tablets date to roughly 1360 to 1332 BC, the reigns of pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. They are the diplomatic correspondence of Egypt's royal court, letters to and from the pharaoh, sent by kings throughout the ancient Near East and preserved in the Egyptian Royal Archive. And when scholars learned to read them, the first thing they noticed was the tone. These letters don't sound like ancient documents. They sound like a group text chain between competitive but mutually dependent business partners. Kings address each other as brother, a formal term of diplomatic equality that also carries genuine warmth in some cases. They exchange elaborate gifts and then complain, in writing, when the gifts don't meet expectations. A Babylonian king essentially nags the pharaoh about a gold shipment that's taking too long. An Assyrian king sends gifts and then itemizes, in detail, what he expects in return. A Mitanni king reminds Egypt that his previous requests haven't been answered and he's starting to feel disrespected. One letter from the king of Elashia, Cyprus, to the pharaoh apologizes because he can't send as much copper as usual due to a plague outbreak among his workers. He's not making excuses, he explains. He's just being transparent about supply chain disruptions. Supply chain disruptions in 1350 BC, written on a clay tablet sent across the Mediterranean. The Amarna letters reveal a world that was, in terms of its diplomatic and commercial sophistication, strikingly modern. These weren't primitive warlords exchanging tribute out of fear. They were statesmen managing complex relationships across thousands of miles, operating within a shared framework of international norms, expectations, and obligations. There were rules. Unwritten but clearly understood rules about how great kings treated each other, what gifts were appropriate for what occasions, how quickly correspondence should be answered, what counted as an insult, and what counted as an acceptable delay. There was a shared language. Akkadian, the Semitic language of Mesopotamia, served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the entire Bronze Age world. An Egyptian pharaoh wrote to a Hittite king in Akkadian. A Hittite king wrote to a Cypriot ruler in Akkadian. A Mesopotamian king wrote to Egypt in Akkadian. It was the English of its age, not because everyone loved it, but because it worked, because everyone had agreed, implicitly, to use it. There was infrastructure, professional scribes who knew both their native language and Akkadian, messengers who knew the routes and the protocols, systems for authenticating letters, seals, specific formulae, recognized formats that distinguished genuine royal correspondence from forgery. There was a shared concept of the international order. The Amarna letters reveal a world in which a handful of great powers, Egypt, Hatti, the Hittites, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, Alashia, recognized each other as legitimate players in a game with shared rules. Lesser kingdoms were clients or allies of the great powers. Trade and diplomacy flowed through established channels. Marriages linked royal houses across thousands of miles. This was not anarchy. This was a system. But here's what makes the Amarna letters especially relevant to understanding what came after. They are, essentially, server logs. They're records of a network in operation. And when you read them carefully, you start to see not just the system working, but the system showing signs of stress. Later, Amarna letters include requests that have an edge of desperation. Grain shipments are requested urgently. Military assistance is sought with a directness that suggests normal diplomatic pleasantries have been dropped. There are complaints about messages going unanswered, about gifts not arriving, about commitments not being honored. The system was under pressure, in ways that the participants could feel, but not quite diagnose. They didn't know what was coming. None of them did. The scribes who pressed those tablets couldn't see that they were documenting the peak of something, the high water mark of Bronze Age interconnection, just before the tide began to go out. But we can see it. And what we see should feel familiar, because the pattern, hyperconnection followed by hyperfragility, is one that our own age is intimately acquainted with. Because the deeper you dig into how the Bronze Age network actually functioned, the more you encounter a concept that modern systems theorists have a specific name for. A concept that explains both why the network was so successful and why it was so vulnerable. Tight coupling. Let's talk about tight coupling. In 1984, a sociologist named Charles Perrow published a book called Normal Accidents. His argument was simple and deeply unsettling. Some systems are so tightly interconnected that accidents, catastrophic failures, are not just possible, but inevitable. Not because of bad design or human error, but because of the nature of complexity itself. Perrow was writing about nuclear power plants and chemical factories and air traffic control systems. He had no idea he was also writing about the Bronze Age, but he was. A tightly coupled system is one where the components are so interdependent that a failure in one part propagates rapidly through the whole. There's no slack, no buffer. When something goes wrong, there's no time to intervene, no redundancy to absorb the shock, no alternative pathway for the system to reroute around the problem. Loosely coupled systems are different. In a loosely coupled system, problems stay local. A factory that runs out of one part can substitute another, or wait for a resupply, or reorganize its production schedule. A community that has a bad harvest can draw on stored reserves, or trade with neighbors, or shift to different crops. Failures happen, but they don't cascade. The Bronze Age world, at its peak, was tightly coupled in exactly the way Pero was describing. And the mechanism of that tight coupling was the dependency structure we've been tracing. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, craftsmen who specialized in specific skills, merchants who controlled specific routes, palace elites whose power rested on their monopoly over access to distant resources. Everyone depended on everyone else. The system worked magnificently when it worked, and it had very little capacity to absorb shocks. Consider what a disruption in tin supply actually meant. It didn't just mean a shortage of tin, it meant less bronze. Less bronze meant fewer weapons. Fewer weapons meant a weakened military. A weakened military meant less capacity to defend trade routes. Less capacity to defend trade routes meant more disruption to trade. More disruption to trade meant less tin. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing, and it ran in only one direction. Now multiply this across every critical dependency in the system. Copper supply, grain distribution, timber access, the availability of skilled craftsmen, the stability of political relationships that guaranteed safe passage for merchants, the reliability of palace economies to pay their workers and soldiers and scribes. Each of these was a potential cascade point, a place where a failure could propagate. And there's something else that made the Bronze Age system especially vulnerable, something that Pero would have recognized immediately. The system had no central governance. There was no Bronze Age version of the United Nations, no international authority that could coordinate responses to system-wide stress. There were great powers, and there were diplomatic norms, and there were treaties. But when things started going wrong, there was no mechanism to prevent each state from responding in ways that were rational for itself, but catastrophic for the system as a whole. Imagine the tin routes from Afghanistan disrupted by war, by drought, by political instability in the regions they passed through. Individual states, feeling the squeeze, would compete for whatever tin remained. They'd outbid each other, potentially cutting off smaller players. They'd consider military action to secure access. They'd divert resources from other areas to compensate. Each of these responses is locally rational. Each of them makes the overall system less stable. This is the tragedy of commons at civilizational scale, and the Bronze Age world had no mechanism to escape it. Modern economists and systems theorists have a phrase for the situation we've been describing: single points of failure. Nodes in a network whose failure cascades through the whole system. The Internet was specifically designed by DARPA in the 1960s to avoid single points of failure, to root around damage, to have redundancy built into its architecture. The Bronze Age network wasn't designed. It evolved, and it evolved toward efficiency, not resilience. Here's what's haunting about that. Because our own global supply chains evolved the same way. Just-in-time manufacturing, single-source suppliers for critical components, geographic concentration of production in whatever location minimized costs. The global semiconductor supply chain, which concentrates advanced chip manufacturing in a handful of facilities in Taiwan and South Korea. The global shipping network, which routes an extraordinary percentage of trade through a small number of choke points like the Suez Canal. These systems are efficient. They are extraordinarily efficient. They are also tightly coupled in ways that create systemic fragility. When the Suez Canal was blocked for 6 days in March 2021 by a single container ship running aground, the disruption rippled through global supply chains for months. 6 days. One ship. Months of downstream consequences. The Bronze Age merchants and kings who built their world around a global tin trade had no way to know they were building a Suez Canal. But they were. They were building efficiency at the cost of resilience, and like every generation before and since, they assumed the system would keep working because it had always worked. It didn't always work. The failure, when it came, was not a single event. It was a cascade, a perfect storm of compounding failures that hit an already tightly coupled system from multiple directions simultaneously. It was, in the language of complexity theory, a systems collapse. And to understand how it happened, we need to follow the cascade from the beginning, from the first tremors in the environmental and political foundations of the Bronze Age world to the final silence of the palace archives. Because the collapse didn't start with raiders. It started with rain. Or rather, with the absence of it. There is a lake in Turkey called Lake Van. It sits high in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, over 5,000 feet above sea level, cold and deep and very blue. It's one of the world's largest landlocked lakes. It's also an archive. At the bottom of Lake Van, year after year for thousands of years, sediment has settled in thin layers, spring layers of light-colored minerals, winter layers of dark organic material, alternating like tree rings, each one a record of conditions in that watershed during that particular year. Varves, scientists call them. And when researchers extract core samples from that sediment and analyze the chemistry and thickness of each layer, they can reconstruct, in extraordinary detail, the climate history of eastern Anatolia going back millennia. What those cores show, for the period around 1200 BC, is not ambiguous. The layers get thinner, the chemistry shifts. The markers of drought-tolerant plant pollen increase, while the markers of agricultural vegetation decrease. The data, cross-referenced with similar core samples from lakes in the Levant and Cyprus, with stalagmite records from caves in Israel and Turkey, with pollen from ancient agricultural fields across the eastern Mediterranean. All of it tells the same story. Sometime around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged and severe drought. Not just a bad year or two, not just a regional dry spell, a multi-decade pattern of reduced rainfall that made farming significantly more precarious across the same geographic region that was home to every major Bronze Age civilization. The archaeologist Brandon Drake, analyzing pollen data from sites across Cyprus and the Levant, documented what he called a significant shift toward drier conditions beginning in the late 13th century BC and persisting for generations. The historian Brandon Drake was careful about his language, consistent with severe aridification rather than proof of catastrophic drought, because science demands precision. But the pattern is unmistakable when you look at enough data points from enough locations. The sky was closing, quietly, incrementally, across decades. And the civilizations that depended on stable harvests to fund their armies and feed their populations and maintain their palace economies didn't notice it happening until they were already in trouble. Now add earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The African, Eurasian, and Arabian tectonic plates are all jostling against each other in this part of the world, creating a complex tangle of fault lines that runs through Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and down into Egypt. The geophysicist Amos Noor spent decades arguing that the late Bronze Age collapse coincided with what he called an earthquake storm, a sequence of major seismic events rippling through the region over a span of roughly 50 years. Not one catastrophic earthquake, but multiple major earthquakes at different locations, each one potentially triggering stress relief elsewhere along connected fault systems. The archaeological evidence is suggestive, if not conclusive. At Mycenaean, the great citadel of Bronze Age Greece, there's a destruction layer from around 1200 BC, where stones have shifted sideways off their foundations in patterns that look more like seismic damage than military attack. At Tiryns, another Mycenaean fortress, walls show similar evidence of sudden ground movement. At Ugarit, some buildings show the characteristic collapse pattern of earthquake damage, walls fallen inward from multiple directions, heavy foundation stones displaced in ways that don't match fire or human assault. Noor's earthquake storm hypothesis remains debated among specialists. The evidence is uneven, and some destructions clearly have other explanations. But even conservative estimates acknowledge that significant seismic activity occurred in this region during the relevant period, and that earthquakes, combined with everything else that was going wrong, would have been catastrophic. Because here's what drought and earthquakes do to a palace economy when they hit simultaneously. The palace economy, the centralized redistributive system that organized Bronze Age civilization, was already operating under strain from the drought. Less grain coming in, same expenses going out. The great storerooms were emptying faster than they could be refilled. Kings were writing increasingly desperate letters to neighboring rulers, requesting emergency grain shipments. We have one of these letters from the Hittite king, probably Tudhaliya IV, writing to Egypt sometime in the late 13th century BC. The translation, stripped of its diplomatic formalities, is essentially, "We are starving. Send grain." An earthquake in this context isn't just a disaster. It's a disaster piling onto a system that has no slack left to absorb it. Cracked walls require timber to repair, timber that has to be imported, that costs silver, or goods that are already in short supply. Collapsed storage jars mean lost grain at exactly the moment when grain is most scarce. Damaged harbor infrastructure means delayed shipments from suppliers who are also facing their own pressures. And frightened, hungry people are more likely to do desperate things. Now add the sea peoples. The Egyptian records, carved into the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, describe what happened around 1177 BC in language that sounds like the end of the world. A coalition of foreign peoples. The Egyptians listed them by name: the Peliset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, came by land and by sea, bringing their families with them, burning cities across the Levant and moving toward Egypt. Medinet Habu shows them in dramatic carved relief: warriors in feathered headdresses, families in ox carts, naval battles in the channels of the Nile Delta. Ramesses claimed victory. He stopped them. Egypt held. But who were the sea peoples? 3,000 years of scholarship hasn't produced a definitive answer, and this, more than anything, is what makes them so important to understand. The traditional narrative, Bronze Age civilization was doing fine until barbarian raiders showed up and destroyed everything, doesn't survive contact with the archaeological evidence. The destructions don't move in a consistent direction. Some cities show evidence of abandonment before they were burned, suggesting internal collapse rather than external attack. Some regions show the pattern of earthquake damage followed later by fire, suggesting multiple overlapping catastrophes. Some sites were never burned at all, just quietly abandoned. The more historians look at the evidence, the more they conclude that the sea peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of it. Here's the more likely scenario. As the Bronze Age world came under stress, from drought, from reduced agricultural productivity, from the political instability that follows economic stress, populations in peripheral regions began to be displaced. Small farmers who could no longer pay their palace taxes, soldiers who weren't being paid, merchants whose trade routes had dried up, former sailors of the great maritime powers whose homelands were already burning. These people didn't disappear. They gathered. They acquired ships. There were plenty of ships available in a world where maritime trade was collapsing. They sailed to wherever they thought there might be food and opportunity. They sometimes raided, sometimes traded, sometimes tried to settle. They picked up followers from the next place they destabilized. In other words, the sea peoples were refugees, desperate, mobile, sometimes violent refugees, created by the same cascade of failures that was burning the cities they were attacking. Ramesses III's great triumph at the Nile Delta was real. Egypt did hold. But the triumph is also, in a certain light, a description of a civilization fighting itself. The people in those ox carts, the families mixed among the warriors in the Medinet Habu reliefs, they had come from somewhere, from cities that had burned, from farms that had failed, from a world that was collapsing around them. Egypt stopped the wave. But it couldn't stop what had generated the wave in the first place. Now step back. Look at all of this together. Drought-reducing agricultural output across the region for decades. Earthquakes damaging critical infrastructure at multiple major cities. Political instability as palace economies struggled to maintain their obligations under worsening conditions. trade networks fragmenting as merchants found routes unsafe and partners unable to honor contracts. Populations displaced and radicalized, states responding to shared system stress by competing rather than cooperating. This is not a list of separate causes. This is a cascade. In complex systems theory, a cascade failure happens when a system under stress encounters multiple simultaneous stressors that interact and amplify each other. The failures don't add, they multiply. Each failure makes the system less capable of handling the next failure. The interconnections that were the system's strength become the pathways through which failure propagates. The Bronze Age Internet didn't crash because of a single virus, a single attack, a single failure point. It crashed because a series of environmental and political stressors hit an already tightly coupled system from multiple directions at once, and the system had no resilience, no slack, no redundancy, no alternative pathways with which to respond. The Uluburun ship's cargo manifest is beautiful. 10 tons of copper, a ton of tin, amber from the Baltic, ebony from Africa, glass from Mesopotamia, all in one 50-foot ship. That beautiful, impossible cargo manifest is also a fragility map. Every item on it represents a dependency. Every dependency represents a place where the system could break. And somewhere between 1200 and 1177 BC, enough of those dependencies broke simultaneously that the whole network went down. Not everywhere at once, not all for the same reasons. The collapse was uneven, messy, partial. Some cities survived, some regions barely noticed. Egypt held on, scarred but standing. But the network, the Bronze Age Internet, was gone. The clay tablet email system went dark. The Akkadian diplomatic lingua franca fell out of use. The copper and tin supply chain that had sustained Bronze Age military power collapsed. The palace economies that had coordinated redistribution across the eastern Mediterranean ceased to function. And in the silence that followed, something unexpected began. When a monopoly collapses, sometimes something better grows in its place. This is not a comforting thought. It's cold comfort to the people who lived through the collapse, who watched their cities burn, and their trade networks evaporate, and their literacy systems disappear. But it's historically accurate, and it's one of the most important things to understand about what happened after 1177 BC. The Bronze Age Internet was, among other things, a monopoly system, not consciously, not by design, but by the nature of its dependencies. Bronze required copper and tin. Copper and tin required long-distance trade. Long-distance trade required maritime power and diplomatic relationships. Maritime power and diplomatic relationships required palace economies large and stable enough to sustain them, and palace economies concentrated power in ways that made the whole system dependent on a small number of elite nodes. You couldn't be a Bronze Age power without access to the network. And the network was controlled, ultimately, by the great palaces, Egypt, Hatti, Mycenaean, Babylon, who set the terms of trade and enforced the diplomatic protocols and had the military muscle to ensure compliance. When those palaces fell, so did the monopoly. What grew in its place was, in several important respects, more open, more distributed, more resilient, though it took centuries for that resilience to become apparent. Let's start with iron. Iron had been known throughout the Bronze Age. Small quantities were worked from rare iron ores and occasionally from meteoritic iron, iron that fell from the sky, which the Egyptians called metal of heaven and treated as almost supernaturally valuable. But iron smelting was difficult. You needed temperatures significantly higher than bronze casting required. The early iron objects were often of inferior quality compared to good bronze. And in a world where bronze was abundant enough for those who could access the network, and iron metallurgy was still being developed, there was no strong incentive to switch. That changed after the collapse. When the bronze supply chain fractured, smiths throughout the Mediterranean and Near East found themselves with a problem. How do you make metal tools and weapons when you can't reliably get copper and tin? The answer, for many, was you learn to work with what's local, and iron ore was far more locally available than tin. Iron smelting technology spread through the early first millennium BC in a way that has no single clear origin point. It seems to have diffused from multiple centers simultaneously: Anatolia, the Levant, possibly Cyprus, spreading through the same networks of maritime trade and cultural exchange that were slowly, fitfully rebuilding after the collapse. The key difference between iron and bronze, from a geopolitical standpoint, is this: you don't need a global supply chain for iron. You need local ore, local fuel, and local expertise. All three were available in far more places than the copper-tin combination that bronze required. Iron democratized metallurgy. Not instantly, not completely. Early iron was often inferior to good bronze, and the knowledge of how to work it properly was itself a scarce resource for a while. But the direction of change was clear. Over the first millennium BC, iron tools and weapons became increasingly common, increasingly affordable, and increasingly available to people and societies that the Bronze Age network had excluded or exploited. Small kingdoms could now arm their own soldiers without depending on distant tin suppliers. Farmers could afford iron tools that would have been unthinkably expensive in bronze. The monopoly of the palace elites, which rested substantially on their control of access to the bronze supply chain, was undermined. Now consider the alphabet. Bronze Age palace economies were, among other things, information management systems. They tracked grain deliveries and textile production, and chariot inventories and labor assignments with a thoroughness that required significant clerical infrastructure. Scribes were specialists. Writing was a profession, not a general skill. Linear B in Mycenaean Greece, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphics in Egypt. These were complex systems that took years to learn and required institutional support to maintain. When the palaces fell, the palace writing systems fell with them. Linear B disappeared completely when the Mycenaean palaces burned. Cuneiform survived in Mesopotamia, but its use contracted dramatically. The literate administration of the Bronze Age world went dark. But along the Levantine coast, in the Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, which had survived the collapse damaged but not destroyed, a different approach to writing had been developing, an approach that would change everything. The Phoenician alphabet was not exactly new in 1200 BC. Its antecedents stretched back to early Semitic scripts of the second millennium. But it was in the post-collapse period that it spread, as Phoenician merchants began to extend their commercial reach into the vacuum left by fallen Bronze Age powers. The principle of the Phoenician alphabet is elegantly simple: a small number of signs, 22 consonants, that can be combined to represent any word in the language. No ideographs, no syllabic complexity, no requirement for years of specialized training. A motivated learner could master the alphabet in weeks. This was not a royal technology. This was not something that required a palace to implement. It was a merchant's tool, designed for practical record-keeping by people who needed to write quickly and accurately without a team of trained scribes. It was open-source literacy. Anyone could learn it. Anyone could use it. The Greeks picked up the Phoenician alphabet, probably through trading contact in the 9th or 8th century BC, and added vowels to create the Greek alphabet. The Etruscans adapted the Greek alphabet. The Romans adapted the Etruscan version. And from the Roman alphabet descended, through various transformations, the letters you're reading right now. The alphabet you use every day is a product of the Bronze Age collapse. Without the palace monopolies falling, without the elite writing systems going dark, without Phoenician merchants needing a practical, portable, teachable writing system for their post-collapse trading networks, the chain of transmission that produced modern alphabetic literacy might never have formed. But perhaps the most profound consequence of the collapse wasn't technological. It was political. The Bronze Age world was organized around palace economies with highly concentrated power. There were gradations. Some palaces were more powerful than others. Some vassal relationships were more equal than others. But the basic structure was hierarchical, centralized, and dependent on controlling access to resources and trade networks. After the collapse, that structure was gone or weakened across most of the Eastern Mediterranean. And in the space it left behind, new forms of political organization began to emerge. In the highlands of Canaan, small farming communities were pulling together around shared identities and local institutions, the communities that would eventually coalesce into what the Hebrew Bible calls Israel and Judah. In the coastal cities of Phoenicia, merchant oligarchies were developing because there was no great king to impose a palace economy. In Greece, after the Dark Age, something entirely new crystallized. The polis, the city-state, a community of citizens, however narrowly defined, who governed themselves through debate and collective decision-making rather than royal command. From the Greek polis would come Athenian democracy. From Athenian democracy would come, through Rome, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, the political traditions that underpin every democratic state in the modern world. It is a breathtaking chain of causation. The Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophe by any measure, created the conditions for political experiments that would not have been possible under the old palace regime. The distributed, fragmented, less hierarchical world that emerged from the collapse was, in the long run, more innovative, not because suffering is good, but because the monopolies had broken. When open-source software emerged in the 1980s as a challenger to proprietary systems, it was driven by a similar logic: distributed contribution, shared standards, no single point of failure, no monopoly on innovation. The Bronze Age Internet was a proprietary system. What replaced it was closer to open source. The Phoenicians didn't trademark the alphabet. The Greeks didn't charge licensing fees for the polis. The ironsmithing knowledge that spread through the post-collapse Mediterranean wasn't patented. It was shared, adapted, built upon, and over the centuries that followed, it produced a world more complex, more innovative, and more resilient than the one it replaced. None of this was visible to the people who lived through the collapse. They experienced it as darkness, the loss of written records, the disappearance of luxury goods, the fragmentation of the international order, the burning of the cities. For them, it was not an opening. It was an ending. But endings are not always what they look like from inside them. Let's come back to the present. Because here's the thing about studying the Bronze Age collapse: the longer you look at it, the less ancient it feels. We have built, in the 21st century, a global network of extraordinary sophistication and speed. Information moves at the speed of light through undersea fiber-optic cables. Goods move on container ships and cargo planes through a supply chain of breathtaking complexity. Financial systems are interconnected across every time zone. The diplomatic, commercial, and communicative networks of the modern world make the Bronze Age system look like a prototype, which it was. But the structural vulnerabilities are eerily similar, and in some respects, we've made them worse. Consider the concentration problem. The Bronze Age tin supply was geographically concentrated in a small number of distant sources: Afghanistan, possibly Cornwall, a few other locations. Modern global supply chains have created their own concentration points. Roughly 90% of advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity is located in Taiwan. A significant proportion of global pharmaceutical production depends on active ingredients manufactured in India and China. The lithium batteries that power the transition to electric vehicles depend on lithium extracted from a small number of mines in South America. These are not secrets. The people who study supply chain resilience have been writing about these concentration points for years. And yet, the pressures of market efficiency, the same pressures that drove Bronze Age palace economies towards specialization and interconnection, have pushed global supply chains toward greater concentration, not less. The efficiency gains are real. Concentrating advanced chip manufacturing in Taiwan, where the expertise and infrastructure have been built up over decades, produces better chips at lower costs. There are genuine reasons why things are organized the way they are. The Bronze Age network was not irrationally organized either. It made sense to mine copper where the copper was and tin where the tin was. The inefficiency of any other arrangement was obvious. The systemic risk was not. Consider the coupling problem. Modern just-in-time manufacturing was developed in the mid-20th century as an efficiency improvement. Instead of warehousing large inventories, you order components as you need them, reducing storage costs and improving cash flow. It worked beautifully during the long period of stable global trade it was designed for. And then, COVID-19 disrupted global shipping, and automobile manufacturers around the world couldn't get semiconductors, and car production dropped precipitously, not because the chips didn't exist, but because the just-in-time supply chain had no slack to absorb the disruption. Automotive plants in Michigan and Germany shut down because of chip shortages traced to a small number of foundries in Taiwan. This is tight coupling. This is the Bronze Age tin supply disruption, played out in real time, in a world that should have known better. Consider the communication vulnerability. The Bronze Age diplomatic network ran on Akkadian, a shared language that enabled communication across cultural and political boundaries. Our networks run on TCP/IP, HTML, English, and a set of technical protocols that are largely standardized across the global internet. This standardization enables the extraordinary interconnection of the modern web. It also means that vulnerabilities in shared systems propagate globally. A zero-day exploit in a widely used software library affects every system running that library, everywhere in the world. A flaw in BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol that routes internet traffic between autonomous networks, can disrupt traffic on a global scale. When Amazon Web Services, which hosts a significant fraction of the global internet's applications, experiences a major outage, the effects are felt simultaneously across thousands of services and millions of users. The Bronze Age scribes who wrote in Akkadian were using their era's shared protocol. When the system that maintained that protocol, the palace economies, the great power diplomatic network, collapsed, Akkadian fell out of use within a generation or two. Communication across the Eastern Mediterranean was severely degraded for centuries. We are not at risk of our internet protocols failing the way Akkadian failed. The analogy is not perfect. But the underlying dynamic, shared systems creating shared vulnerabilities, efficiency creating fragility, is the same. Consider the climate problem. Bronze Age climate change, the prolonged drought of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, was not caused by human activity. It was a natural variation in the climate system. But it hit a human civilization that was not designed to be resilient to it. Modern climate change is caused by human activity. It is projected to cause, among other things, disruptions to agricultural production, rising sea levels threatening coastal infrastructure, increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, and instability in regions that are already politically fragile. These disruptions will interact with the supply chains and infrastructure and political systems that underpin modern civilization in ways that are, in the technical sense, non-linear. Non-linear means you can't simply add up the individual effects and predict the outcome. It means the interactions between different stressors may produce outcomes larger than the sum of their parts. It means the system may appear stable right up until the moment it isn't. The Bronze Age civilizations didn't know the climate was changing in a way their system couldn't handle. They experienced individual bad years, not the end of the Bronze Age world. Farmers noticed their harvests were down. Kings noticed the grain stores were running low. Scribes recorded emergency food shipments and requests for foreign grain. They didn't have a model that told them, in 50 years, this system will not exist. We have models. We have the Bronze Age as a data point. We have complexity theory, supply chain resilience research, climate science, geopolitical risk analysis. We have everything we need to understand that highly efficient, tightly coupled, globally interconnected systems are vulnerable to cascading failures in ways that less efficient but more resilient systems are not. Whether we act on that understanding is a different question, and the Bronze Age doesn't offer an encouraging precedent. Because here's the thing about the palace economies of the late Bronze Age: they knew something was wrong. The Hittite king wrote desperate letters begging for grain. The king of Ugarit recorded the coastal watchers being mobilized. Egyptian inscriptions from the late Ramesside period boast about feeding the hungry, which is what rulers say when they're terrified of unrest. They felt the system straining. They responded, for the most part, by tightening control, extracting more from their populations, guarding the storerooms more closely, mobilizing more soldiers to hold the borders, which is the rational response from the perspective of each individual palace, and which, in aggregate, made the system less stable. Systemic fragility is hard to fix from inside the system. The incentives that drove the system toward efficiency, the same incentives that made it fragile, don't disappear just because you can see the problem. Every Bronze Age palace that concentrated tin imports was making a rational decision. Every modern corporation that offshores manufacturing to the lowest cost location is making a rational decision. The irrationality is at the system level, not the individual level. This is the genuinely hard part of the Bronze Age lesson. It's not that the ancient peoples were stupid or short-sighted. They were neither. They were rational actors operating within a system that rewarded efficiency and punished the investment in resilience that might have saved it. The Uluburun ship's captain, loading those 10 tons of copper ingots and ton of tin and Baltic amber and African ebony, was doing his job competently and professionally. He was operating the system as it was designed to operate. He was not being reckless. He was being efficient. His ship still sank. The Bronze Age internet still crashed. And the civilizations it sustained still fell. Let's end where we began, with a tablet in the ruins of Ugarit, the tablet that the last scribe pressed in the last hours of one of the ancient world's greatest cities wasn't addressed to posterity. It wasn't a monument, not a declaration for future historians. It was a message, urgent, practical, probably terrified, from a king who needed help and thought help might still come. Help didn't come. The city burned. The tablet survived. For 3,000 years, it sat in the ruins, perfectly preserved by the fire that baked it, waiting in the dark for someone to dig it up and learn to read it. And when archaeologists finally did, what they found was not the wisdom of ages, not profound philosophical insight, just a last-minute request sent too late from a world that was ending. We read it now. We read all the tablets now. The Amarna letters, the Uluburun cargo manifest, the desperate grain requests of the Hittite kings, the meticulous linear B inventories from Pylos, still damp when the fire came. We read them all, and we know how the story ends, and we can see, with the clarity of retrospect, the system's fragility in ways the participants couldn't. But knowing how a story ends doesn't always change how we behave inside our own story. The Bronze Age scribes who were carefully recording the coastal watchers being mobilized at Pylos were doing their jobs right up until the moment the building burned. The palace administrators who were tracking grain distributions in Egypt in the twilight of the New Kingdom were keeping careful records right up until the point where the records stopped mattering. They were competent people operating in a world that was, structurally, beyond any individual's capacity to fix. The Bronze Age Internet was one of the greatest achievements in human history. A genuinely global network, Not metaphorically global, not approximately global, but spanning thousands of miles and dozens of cultures, and an astonishing range of languages and goods and ideas. Built without digital technology, built on clay and bronze, and the willingness of human beings to travel across dangerous seas for profit. It fed populations, it enabled specialization that produced extraordinary art and architecture and military technology. It created diplomatic norms that made war between great powers less frequent and less total than it might otherwise have been. It linked the world in ways that reduced isolation and enabled the cross-pollination of ideas and technologies. It also created fragility on a civilizational scale. It concentrated power in ways that made the system dependent on a small number of elite nodes. It created interdependencies that, under stress, became vectors for cascading failure. It optimized for efficiency at the expense of resilience, and it crashed, taking with it, in the space of a few decades, most of the major civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The crash was not the end. In the rubble, new things grew: iron, the alphabet, the polis. New political experiments, new technologies, new forms of social organization that were, in the long run, more adaptive than what they replaced. But the people who lived through the crash didn't know about the long run. They knew about the burning. The silence where the scribes had been. The ships that didn't come anymore. The markets that closed. The languages that were forgotten. We are, right now, in the middle of our own version of the Bronze Age Internet. We have built a global network of extraordinary sophistication. We have created interdependencies at a scale that would have been incomprehensible to the Hittite scribes who begged Egypt for grain. We have optimized our supply chains for efficiency, and our information systems for speed, and our financial systems for profit. We have done what every civilization does. We have built for the world we have, not the world that might come. The sediment cores from Lake Van are still being analyzed. The Uluburun wreck is still being studied. The Amarna letters are still being translated and debated. The Bronze Age, 3,000 years later, is still teaching us. Whether we're learning is a different question. The last scribe at Ugarit pressed that tablet into wet clay in the hour before the end. The message was never sent, or was sent, and never answered. The palace burned. The city was never rebuilt. But the tablet survived. And now we can read it. That's something. In the very long run, the fact that the signal can still be received, that the message baked into permanence by a fire that ended an age, is still legible to us across 3 millennia, that's something. The question is whether we're listening, or whether we're too busy loading cargo onto efficient ships, optimizing our supply chains, writing urgent messages on our own versions of clay tablets to notice what the sediment has been trying to tell us. That every network has a point of failure. That every system imagines itself permanent. And that the distance between peak sophistication and catastrophic collapse can be, historically speaking, very small. Sleep well or don't. Either way, the world will keep turning, and the sediment will keep settling, one thin layer at a time. Before the collapse, there was a world. A real, breathing, politically complex world of competing and cooperating civilizations. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what existed. Egypt in 1300 BC was the closest thing the Bronze Age had to a superpower. The New Kingdom pharaohs, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Rameses II, commanded an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. Egyptian gold, extracted from mines in Nubia, made Egypt the financial center of the Bronze Age world. Everyone wanted Egyptian gold. The Amarna letters are full of requests for it, sometimes politely, sometimes not. The Egyptian state was also extraordinarily stable by ancient standards. While other civilizations experienced cycles of rapid rise and fall, Egypt maintained recognizable political continuity for over 3,000 years. Part of this was geography. The desert barriers on either side of the Nile Valley were formidable natural defenses. Part of it was the Nile itself, which provided annual irrigation so reliable that Egyptian agriculture was less vulnerable to rainfall variability than almost any other Bronze Age economy. This relative stability made Egypt both a crucial anchor of the Bronze Age system and, paradoxically, a civilization that had difficulty adapting when the system changed. Stability breeds rigidity. The institutions that made Egypt resilient also made it slow. The Hittite Empire was the other great power of the late Bronze Age, and in some ways the most sophisticated. Based in Hattusa, a fortified capital in the mountains of central Anatolia, the Hittites built an empire through a combination of military force and diplomatic skill that modern scholars still find impressive. The Hittites were masters of the vassal treaty. They developed elaborate legal frameworks for integrating conquered or allied states into their empire in ways that preserved local autonomy while securing loyalty. The Treaty of Kadesh, negotiated after the famous battle between Hittite and Egyptian forces around 1274 BC, is the oldest known international peace treaty whose text survives. It includes provisions for mutual defense, extradition of refugees, and oaths sworn before the gods of both parties. It is, in its way, a document of extraordinary civilization, two great powers stepping back from a destructive war and building a legal framework for coexistence. The treaty worked, more or less, for about a century. Long enough for the Hittites and Egyptians to become, in some sense, partners rather than adversaries. And then the system that made the treaty possible began to fail. Mycenaean Greece is the civilization that gave us the mythology we still tell. Troy, Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, these names come from a tradition rooted in the Mycenaean world, even if the specific events they describe are legendary. The Mycenaean civilization was centered on palace complexes at sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, massive stone fortresses that served as administrative centers for sophisticated palace economies. The Linear B tablets from Pylos, deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952, revealed a civilization of extraordinary administrative complexity. Scribes tracked everything: flocks of sheep, quantities of olive oil, numbers of chariot wheels, rations for different categories of workers, religious offerings to different deities. Pylos alone produced over 1,000 tablets in the decades before the palace's destruction. All of them were preserved by the fire that burned the palace around 1180 BC. The irony is almost too perfect. The civilization's administrative records survive because of the catastrophe that ended the civilization. Cyprus, ancient Alatia, sits at the intersection of the Bronze Age trade routes like a toll booth. The island was one of the largest copper-producing regions in the ancient world, and its strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean made it a crucial hub for goods moving between Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean. The Amarna letters include correspondence from the king of Alatia, who writes to the pharaoh as a peer, not quite an equal of the great powers, but a player whose cooperation was essential to the system's functioning. Cypriot copper flowed through virtually every Bronze Age workshop in the eastern Mediterranean. When Cyprus was disrupted, the disruption was felt everywhere. Ugarit was the great port city of the Levantine coast, not a great power in its own right, but a node of extraordinary commercial importance. Protected by the kings of Hatti, but commercially linked to Egypt and the Aegean, Ugarit was one of those places where the different strands of the Bronze Age network came together most visibly. Its harbor was a cosmopolitan hub. Its archives contained texts in multiple languages, including the world's oldest known musical notation and a collection of mythological texts that prefigure stories later found in the Hebrew Bible. Ugarit's cosmopolitan character was both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Its wealth depended entirely on the trade network. When the network failed, Ugarit had nothing to fall back on. These were the players. Complex, sophisticated, mutually dependent, individually powerful, and collectively fragile. They built a world that lasted remarkably well for 3 centuries, and then it didn't. Archaeology deals in destruction. This is a little-noted paradox of the discipline. The events that preserve the ancient world best are usually the events that were worst for the ancient world. A city abandoned peacefully disintegrates gradually, its materials reused, its records scattered. A city that burns in a catastrophic fire leaves a carbon-rich destruction layer that seals everything beneath it, preserves pottery and tablets and organic materials, and creates a time capsule that archaeologists can slice through 3,000 years later. The Late Bronze Age is excellent archaeology precisely because so much of it burned. At Mycenaean, the destruction layers from around 1200 BC have been excavated with extraordinary care. What they show is complicated. Some areas show evidence of violent destruction, arrowheads, unburied bodies, signs of hasty abandonment. Other areas show a more gradual process. The palace complex was damaged, perhaps partially rebuilt, then eventually abandoned rather than burned. The linear B tablets from Pylos tell a story that has haunted Bronze Age historians for decades. The last set of tablets recorded includes what appear to be emergency military preparations, deployment of rowers, allocation of bronze for manufacturing weapons, assignment of watchers to coastal positions. The tablets were not finished. Some were still soft when the fire came. The emergency that the scribes were responding to arrived before they could complete their records. At Ugarit, the picture is similarly dramatic. The city was destroyed in a single event, probably around 1185 to 1190 BC. The destruction layer is thick and consistent, a single massive conflagration that consumed the palace and most of the residential areas. Beneath the destruction layer, in the rooms and houses of the last inhabitants, archaeologists found the material of daily life: pottery, storage jars, personal objects, and clay tablets. Some of those tablets were letters, letters from abroad to the king of Ugarit, warning him of the threat. Letters from the king of Ugarit to his neighbors, asking for help. The correspondence of a state that knew it was in danger and was trying, desperately, to respond. The most poignant of all is the letter found in a scribal workshop that was apparently being prepared for sending but never dispatched, perhaps because the messenger never arrived, or never left, or the situation deteriorated too quickly. The letter describes enemy ships offshore. It asks for aid. It was never answered. At other sites across the eastern Mediterranean, the pattern is more varied. Some cities burned and were resettled relatively quickly. Others were burned and abandoned for generations. Some show evidence of gradual depopulation without a dramatic destruction event. Some show earthquake damage beneath fire damage, suggesting multiple overlapping catastrophes. This variability is important. It argues against simple narratives of a single wave of destruction sweeping through the region. The Bronze Age collapse was not the ancient equivalent of an asteroid strike, a single overwhelming force that obliterated everything at once. It was messier, more variable, more complex, which actually makes it more frightening, not less. Because a single overwhelming catastrophic event is something you can point to and learn from and try to prepare for. A cascade of interacting stressors that produce different outcomes in different places at different times. That's harder to see coming and harder to defend against. The archaeology of the Bronze Age collapse is still being actively worked. New sites are excavated every decade. New analytical techniques, isotope analysis, LiDAR surveys, ancient DNA extraction, are producing new data that complicates and enriches the picture. The field is alive in ways that suggest we are still a long way from having the complete story. But the broad outlines are clear, and they look, unmistakably, like a systems failure. Not one cause, many causes. Not one event, many events. Not one moment, a cascade that played out over decades, hitting different parts of an interconnected system in different ways and at different times, until the system as a whole could no longer sustain itself. The Bronze Age world didn't end. It transformed. But the transformation was so total, so rapid by historical standards, and so painful for the people who lived through it, that collapse is not an unfair word for what happened. 3,000 years later, the collapse is still happening in our archaeology labs, and our libraries, and our climate science centers. We are still reading the destruction layers. We are still finding new tablets and new shipwrecks and new pollen cores. The Bronze Age is still talking, and we are still, imperfectly, learning to listen. History doesn't have clean beginning and end dates, but the Late Bronze Age gives us enough anchor points to reconstruct, in broad strokes, how the Cascade unfolded. The following is a composite reconstruction based on the archaeological and textual evidence. Not a definitive account, but a plausible narrative of how things came apart. Around 1250 BC, the Bronze Age system is at or near its peak. Ramesses II has recently completed the Treaty of Kadesh with the Hittites. The Amarna diplomatic network is functioning. The Uluburun ship, or one like it, is making its round of the Mediterranean, loaded with copper and tin, and amber and ebony. Palace economies across the eastern Mediterranean are producing and redistributing goods at an impressive scale. There are stresses. There are always stresses, but the system is managing them. Around 1230 to 1220 BC, climate data suggests the first signs of prolonged drought. Harvests in inland Anatolia begin to show variability. The Hittite heartland, always more vulnerable than the Nile Valley, starts to feel the pressure. There are requests for grain from Egypt, polite at first, then increasingly urgent. Hittite military campaigns into Syria intensify, possibly partly driven by the need to extract tribute from productive agricultural areas to compensate for declining domestic output. Around 1210 to 1200 BC, the first major destructions. Several sites in Greece and the Levant show destruction layers from this period. Some may be the result of local conflicts, some possibly of earthquakes, some possibly of early raids by displaced populations. The great powers are still functioning, but the periphery is becoming unstable. Around 1200 to 1190 BC, the Cascade accelerates. Mycenaean palace at Pylos destroyed around 1180. Several major Levantine port cities, including Ugarit, destroyed within a few decades of each other. Hittite capital Hattusa destroyed around 1180 to 1160. Egypt fights a major battle against the Sea Peoples at the Nile Delta. Rameses III records this as a great victory, and it probably was, in the sense that Egypt survived and the attackers were stopped. Around 1180 to 1150 BC, the network collapses. Long-distance trade in the Bronze Age style, the great palace-to-palace exchange of copper, tin, and luxury goods that characterized the late Bronze Age at its peak, drops dramatically in the archaeological record. The linear B script disappears. Cuneiform use contracts. The Akkadian diplomatic network goes dark. Around 1150 to 1100 BC, the post-collapse world is taking shape. Egypt, under the later Ramesside pharaohs, is contracting, losing its Levantine empire, facing internal instability. In Greece, the Dark Age has begun. In the Levant, Phoenician city-states are starting to expand into the vacuum. In Canaan, new communities are forming in the highlands. Around 1100 to 1000 BC, the new order is emerging. Iron is spreading. The Phoenician alphabet is being refined and will soon be disseminated across the Mediterranean. In Greece, oral traditions are preserving memories of the Bronze Age world that will eventually become the Iliad and Odyssey. The darkness is real. Population levels are lower. Monumental building has stopped. Literacy has contracted. But the future is, slowly, being built. This is not a triumphant narrative. It's a narrative of catastrophic loss, followed by painful, slow, uneven recovery. The people who lived through the destruction years, who watched their cities burn, who survived the famines and displacements, who lived in the poorer, simpler, less connected world that followed. They didn't experience the story as one of creative destruction. They experienced it as loss, but the loss was not total, and the world that grew from the rubble was, in ways that took centuries to become apparent, different in important respects, more distributed, more resilient, less dependent on a single network of interconnected palace economies that had no mechanism for managing system-wide stress. The Bronze Age Internet crashed. The next Internet was already being built in the ruins. Not everything fell. Egypt survived, though diminished. Assyria contracted, but persisted. Babylon was disrupted, but not destroyed. And along the Levantine coast, the Phoenician cities not only survived, but expanded into the vacuum left by the collapse. Why did some hold on when others fell? The answers are illuminating. They tell us something about what kinds of structures are more resilient to systemic stress. Egypt's geographic advantages have already been discussed. The desert buffers, the Nile's relative reliability, the natural choke points that constrained invasion routes. But geography alone doesn't explain Egypt's survival. After all, Egypt was deeply embedded in the Bronze Age trade network. It depended on imported timber, on trade relationships with Cyprus and the Levant, on its ability to project military power beyond its borders. What Egypt had that the Hittites and Mycenaeans lacked was depth, deep institutional capacity, centuries of experience managing large-scale agricultural production and redistribution, deep cultural memory of previous crises and how to survive them, deep geographic insulation from the peripheral instability that destabilized the edges of the Bronze Age world first. Egypt also benefited from one crucial advantage: the Nile. However unreliable the rain might be in Anatolia or the Levant, the Nile still flooded, less reliably than in better years perhaps, but still. Egypt could feed its core population when other civilizations couldn't feed theirs. A state that can feed its people, even barely, is a state that can maintain cohesion. A state that can't is a state facing internal disintegration alongside external pressure. Assyria's survival follows a different logic. The Assyrian state of the mid-first millennium BC, the militaristic empire that terrorized the ancient Near East with its iron-armed armies and brutal conquest policies, is not the same entity as the Bronze Age Assyrian kingdom that preceded the collapse. The Bronze Age Assyria contracted dramatically during the crisis period. It pulled back, tightened its core, and waited. This strategy, contraction rather than collapse, was available to Assyria partly because of its location. The upper Tigris River Valley, where Assyria's core cities sat, had access to reliable water and defensible terrain. It was far enough from the Mediterranean coast to be less exposed to the maritime disruptions that were devastating the Levantine cities. And it had a tradition of military organization that gave it the institutional capacity to maintain coherent state structures, even under severe pressure. The Phoenician cities are the most interesting case. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, these small coastal city-states had been subordinate to Bronze Age great powers for centuries. They supplied timber, purple dye, and maritime expertise to the great palace economies. They were significant nodes in the network, but not central ones. When the network collapsed, the Phoenician cities had two things going for them. First, they were on the coast. Maritime access remained possible, even when inland trade routes were disrupted and political authority was fragmented. Second, they were small enough and flexible enough to adapt. Unlike the Hittite Empire, which had hundreds of thousands of people and vast territories to manage, a Phoenician city-state had only a harbor, a merchant fleet, and the skills to use them. Small, flexible, coastal, and maritime. These turned out to be exactly the right characteristics for the post-collapse world. The Phoenicians didn't just survive the collapse, they thrived in it, expanding into the spaces left by fallen powers and building the commercial networks that would make them the dominant maritime traders of the first millennium BC. The lesson, if there is one, is this. In a system's collapse, the survivors are not always the most powerful players in the old system. They're often the most flexible, the most locally resilient, the least dependent on the specific features of the system that failed. The Hittites were too centralized, too dependent on long supply lines for grain and metals, too reliant on a diplomatic network that evaporated when the great power framework collapsed. Mycenaean was too invested in palace-dependent redistribution. When the palace burned, the whole economy of the Mycenaean world collapsed with it. But the Phoenician merchant sitting in his harbor in Tyre, looking at ships from Egypt and Cyprus and Greece, knowing multiple trade routes and having relationships with buyers and sellers across the Mediterranean, that person had options. When the Egyptian trade collapsed, maybe the Cypriot trade was still viable. When the Cypriot trade fragmented, maybe there were new opportunities to the West. Resilience in complex systems often comes not from strength, but from diversity of options. The Bronze Age's great powers concentrated their power in ways that eliminated options. The survivors often were the ones who had maintained optionality. This is another lesson the Bronze Age is trying to teach us. Whether we're listening, again, is a different question. There's a layer of sediment in the cores from Lake Van that corresponds, roughly, to the decades around 1200 BC. The varves there are thin, bad years, drought years, the kind of years that in the records of the Bronze Age appear as desperate requests for grain. Above that layer, the sediment changes. The pollen from agricultural crops drops off. The pollen from drought-tolerant scrub vegetation increases. The markers of intensive human landscape management diminish. The landscape is pulling back to something older, something wilder, something that predates the palace economies and their demand for cleared fields and managed forests. For a few centuries, the countryside breathes out, and then, slowly, the agricultural markers return. New crops sometimes, new farming techniques occasionally, new communities in new places, gradually. The sediment doesn't know that it's recording the rise of classical civilization. It just records what grows and what doesn't. This is what the silence sounds like, in the language of mud and pollen. Not an ending, but a pause. Not death, but transformation. A system that ran at maximum capacity for 3 centuries, that consumed resources and accumulated interdependencies and optimized relentlessly for efficiency, finally hitting the limits of its own complexity and crashing. And in the pause that followed, in the Dark Age, the centuries of reduced population and contracted trade and forgotten scripts, something different was being worked out. New technologies, new political forms, new ways of organizing the relationship between people and power and resources. The pause lasted roughly 3 to 4 centuries, depending on where you're measuring. And what came after it? The classical world of Greece and Phoenicia and Israel and eventually Rome was not a restoration of what had been. It was something new, built on the ruins of the old, learning from the old's mistakes, even without knowing it was doing so. Iron instead of bronze, alphabets instead of syllabaries, city-states instead of palace economies, citizens, however partially defined, instead of royal subjects. The Bronze Age Internet crashed, and from its crash emerged the operating system that runs, in some form, in the democracies and alphabets and distributed institutions of the modern world. That's not a comforting story, exactly. The comfort would require glossing over the burning cities and the starving populations and the 3 centuries of reduced complexity and human suffering that constituted the Dark Age between the Bronze Age peak and the classical world's emergence. But it's an honest story, and it's the story that the mud is telling, one thin varve at a time, in a deep blue lake in the mountains of eastern Anatolia. The network failed, the signal went dark, the world it had sustained collapsed, and then, in the way that worlds do, it became something else. The last scribe at Ugarit pressed a clay tablet in the hours before the end. The message never arrived. The city burned. The tablet survived. We can read it now. We should. To understand what collapsed in 1177 BC, you need to understand what existed. Not the glamorous version, the gold death masks and the chariots and the heroic battles, but the operational reality. How did these civilizations actually function, day to day, year to year? How did they produce things, distribute things, maintain things? The answer is a system that was, in terms of organizational sophistication, genuinely remarkable, and in terms of structural fragility, genuinely alarming. The palace economy was the dominant organizational form of the Late Bronze Age, in Mycenaean Greece, in Minoan Crete, in the Hittite Empire, in the Canaanite city-states. The palace wasn't just where the king slept. It was the economic center of the entire kingdom, the place where goods were produced, stored, and redistributed. Agriculture, manufacturing, trade, diplomacy, all of it flowed through the palace. Here's how it worked in simplified form. Farmers in the surrounding territory paid taxes in kind: grain, wool, olive oil, livestock. These goods flowed into the palace storerooms, which were managed by a sophisticated bureaucracy of scribes who tracked every delivery in detail. The linear B tablets from Pylos record individual flocks of sheep. Which farm? How many animals? What condition? They record individual deliveries of grain. How much? From whom? On what date? They record the production quotas of individual workshops. How many bronze swords were expected? How many chariot wheels were in storage? How many units of perfumed oil were ready for export? This is not primitive administration. This is a sophisticated management information system, implemented in clay and stored in a palace archive that employed dozens of specialized scribes. The palace then redistributed those goods. Craftsmen in palace workshops received rations, grain and oil, and occasionally bronze for their tools, in exchange for their labor. Soldiers were fed and equipped from palace stores. Temple priests received regular offerings. The palace funded diplomatic missions, equipped armies, maintained roads and harbors. In theory, this was elegant. Everyone contributed to the palace according to their capacity, and the palace provided for everyone according to their need. The palace managed the storage that allowed communities to survive bad years by drawing on reserves built up in good years. It coordinated the specialization of labor that made sophisticated craft production possible. It maintained the diplomatic relationships that kept trade flowing. In practice, the system created several structural problems that would prove fatal under stress. The first was rigidity. The palace economy was calibrated for a particular range of conditions. When harvests were normal, when trade routes were open, when the political situation was stable, the system worked. But the calibration left very little room for adjustment. Fixed quotas, fixed distributions, fixed obligations, these made the system efficient but brittle. When conditions changed, the system had no mechanism for flexible response. It could draw down reserves, but it couldn't fundamentally reorganize itself quickly. The second was inequality. The surplus extracted from the countryside flowed into palace storerooms, and from there was redistributed, but not equally. Palace elites received far more than their numerical share. The administrators and scribes and craftsmen who lived and worked within the palace system were substantially better off than the farmers and shepherds who produced the surplus that funded everything. The Linear B tablets are perfectly clear about this. There are categories of workers who receive generous rations and categories who receive minimal ones, and the line between them tracks almost exactly with proximity to the palace. This inequality was not simply exploitative, it had a logic. The palace's ability to maintain diplomatic relationships, fund military campaigns, and coordinate complex economic activity depended on a professional administrative class that was well enough compensated to maintain loyalty and competence. But inequality creates political risk. When the system is under stress and the palace is tightening allocations, the people at the bottom of the hierarchy feel the pressure most acutely. The third structural problem was centralization itself. The palace was a single point of failure. All the coordination happened there. All the information was stored there. All the diplomatic relationships were managed there. If the palace was destroyed or disrupted by fire, by earthquake, by political crisis, by military defeat, the entire economic system of the kingdom lost its organizing center. There was no fallback, no alternative coordination mechanism, no way for the economy to root around the damaged node. When the Mycenaean palaces burned, the palace economies collapsed completely. Not just the luxury goods trade, everything. The pottery production that had been organized by palace workshops stopped. The olive oil production that had been coordinated by palace administrators stopped. The trade relationships that had been maintained by palace diplomats collapsed. The scribes who kept everything organized scattered or died. And with them went Linear B, the writing system that had been developed specifically to manage palace administration. When the palaces went, the writing system went with them, because there was no institution left to maintain it. The Bronze Age palace economy was, in complexity theory terms, a centralized network, a hub-and-spoke structure rather than a distributed muesh. Hub-and-spoke networks are efficient. They're great at coordination. They're terrible at resilience, because if the hub fails, the whole network fails. The distributed, decentralized networks that replaced the palace economies after the collapse were less efficient, less capable of coordinating large-scale production, less able to fund monumental architecture or standing professional armies. But they were more resilient. They could absorb the failure of individual nodes without systemic collapse. A Phoenician city-state whose harbor was damaged by a storm could recover independently. A Greek polis whose treasury was depleted by a military defeat could reorganize without the whole Greek world shutting down. This trade-off, efficiency versus resilience, is one of the most fundamental in complex systems design. And it's one that every generation of system builders has to grapple with because the pressures of competition always push toward efficiency. Building in redundancy and resilience costs resources. In the short term, those resources could be used for other things. The cost of underinvesting in resilience is only visible when the system is actually stressed. The Bronze Age palace economies made a rational choice from a short-term perspective to optimize for efficiency. They had several centuries of success that validated that choice. And then the stressors came, and the efficiency became the mechanism of collapse. There's a version of this story happening right now in virtually every industry that has embraced just-in-time manufacturing, offshore production concentration, and the elimination of redundant inventory. The efficiency gains are real, and they're being captured right now. The resilience costs are abstract and future-dated. History suggests we should take those future costs seriously. History rarely gets listened to, but it keeps trying. There's a particular kind of historical silence that should disturb anyone who thinks about it too carefully. Not the silence of civilizations we never knew about. That's just ignorance, not absence. The particular silence I'm talking about is the silence of a civilization that was there, that left records and then stopped leaving records. Not because the people died. Not because the civilization ended in any total sense, but because the institutions that maintained literacy collapsed, and without those institutions, writing disappeared from an entire culture for roughly 400 years. This is what happened in Greece after 1200 BC. It is one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of human knowledge. The Mycenaean palace system had maintained a writing system called Linear B, the earliest known form of written Greek. It was a syllabic script, meaning each sign represented a syllable rather than a single sound. It was complex to learn and used primarily for administrative purposes, tracking palace inventories, recording worker rations, documenting religious offerings. It was not used for literature or private communication that we know of. It was a bureaucratic tool maintained by palace scribes serving palace functions. When the palaces burned, the scribes disappeared. Some died, some scattered. But perhaps most importantly, the institutions that trained scribes, the palace schools and administrative systems that taught Linear B to the next generation, ceased to exist. There was no palace to fund them. There was no bureaucracy that needed them. The functional need that had driven the development of Linear B was gone, and so Linear B disappeared. Not through conquest by a foreign power that banned it. Not through a deliberate decision to abandon it. It simply stopped being taught because the institutions that had maintained it stopped functioning. Within a generation or two, the knowledge was lost. For approximately 4 centuries, roughly 1200 to 800 BC, the Greeks were effectively non-literate, at least in the sense of producing written records we can read. No documents were written, no administrative archives were kept, no epic poems were set down on tablets or papyrus. the oral tradition that preserved memories of the Bronze Age world, the traditions that would eventually become the Iliad and Odyssey, did its work in memory and recitation, not in writing. This is one of the reasons we call it a dark age. It's dark from our perspective because the written record goes out. What actually happened during those 4 centuries? How people lived, how communities organized themselves, what they believed, what they produced, is largely recoverable only through archaeology. And archaeology, while enormously informative, cannot tell us what people thought, or said, or feared, or hoped. The Dark Age was not a period of nothing. Archaeological evidence shows continued settlement, continued agricultural production, continued craft production, the development of new pottery styles, the slow beginnings of iron metallurgy. People were living, working, raising families, maintaining communities. The dark was not absolute, but it was darker. Population levels were substantially lower in Greece during the early 1st millennium BC than they had been at the Mycenaean peak. Settlement patterns shifted, fewer large concentrated sites, more dispersed smaller communities, more emphasis on defensible locations. The scale of architectural ambition dropped dramatically. No more Cyclopean palace walls, no more elaborate storage facilities managed by detailed linear B inventories. Long-distance trade contracted sharply. The archaeological evidence of Mycenaean pottery, which had circulated across the entire eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, essentially disappears in the post-collapse archaeological record. The goods that had flowed constantly through the Bronze Age trade network, Cypriot copper, Canaanite storage jars, Egyptian faience, Mycenaean decorated pottery, stopped circulating, or circulated in such reduced quantities that they're barely visible in the archaeological record. The world had become local, and locally poorer. But here's what's interesting about the recovery. When writing returned to Greece, it didn't return as linear B. It returned as something completely different. The alphabetic script borrowed and adapted from the Phoenician trading partners who had maintained a continuous tradition of writing through the Dark Age period. The Greeks took the Phoenician consonantal alphabet, added vowels to represent the phonemes of Greek that the Phoenician system didn't capture, and created what became the Greek alphabet. This new writing system was, in important respects, better than what it replaced. Linear B required years of specialized training. The Greek alphabet, with its small number of signs and consistent phonetic mapping, could in principle be learned by anyone in a matter of weeks. It was not a palace bureaucratic tool. It was a general-purpose communication technology available to merchants and farmers and poets as well as administrators. The first things written in the Greek alphabet were not palace inventories. They were a wine jug inscription that may be a joke or a puzzle, a dedication at a festival, a trader's mark on a storage jar. The ordinary language of ordinary people doing ordinary things, not the rarefied administrative language of a palace scrabble class. The Dark Age had done something unexpected. By eliminating the palace writing system, it had created space for a more democratic, more accessible, more versatile writing system to take hold. If Linear B had survived, would the Greeks have adopted the Phoenician alphabet? Possibly not. The institutional investment in Linear B would have created path dependency, switching costs that might have prevented adoption of a better system. The catastrophe created the opening for improvement. This is not a comfortable lesson because it seems to suggest that catastrophes are net positive for human progress. They're not. The 4 centuries of reduced population, contracted trade, and material poverty that Greece experienced during the Dark Age were not worth the eventual alphabetic literacy. The benefit came despite the catastrophe, not because of it. But the lesson about path dependency is real. Established systems resist replacement even when better alternatives exist. Sometimes it takes a catastrophic disruption to create the conditions for genuinely better alternatives to take hold. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs call this creative destruction, and they usually mean it approvingly because they're imagining themselves as the new technology, not as the people displaced by the collapse of the old one. The Mycenaean scribes who lost their jobs when the palaces burned probably had a less celebratory view of creative destruction. The Greek Dark Age is history's most dramatic example of a technological regression, a loss of capability so total that it took 4 centuries to recover. It's also, paradoxically, a story of how catastrophic loss can create conditions for transformative improvement. Both things are true. Both things are important. Neither one makes the catastrophe good. The silence of 4 centuries tells us something essential about the fragility of knowledge and the institutions that maintain it. Writing seems like a robust technology. It's been around for 5,000 years, but it turns out that writing isn't robust in isolation. It's robust only as long as the institutions that teach it and incentivize its use remain functional. Destroy those institutions, and the technology disappears with them. What institutions in our world maintain the technologies and knowledge systems we take for granted? What happens if those institutions are disrupted? The Bronze Age Dark Age is not a comfortable set of questions to sit with. But it's the right set of questions. International relations, in the modern sense, has a beginning. Not in the United Nations, not in the Peace of Westphalia, not in ancient Rome. International relations as a systematic practice began in the Bronze Age, and it began not because rulers were idealists who believed in peace and cooperation, but because the economics of bronze production left them no choice. When you understand how dependent every Bronze Age great power was on the trade networks that connected them, you understand why they developed sophisticated diplomatic machinery to manage those relationships. Diplomacy was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. It was the social technology that kept the trade network running. At the center of the Bronze Age diplomatic system was the concept of the Great King. This was a formal status recognized by all the major powers that placed certain rulers in a category of peers who could address each other as equals. Great kings exchanged daughters in marriage, sent gold and luxury goods as gifts, wrote each other long formal letters full of elaborate courtesy formulas, and treated each other, at least in the diplomatic register, as legitimate rulers of comparable authority. Below the great kings were vassal kings, rulers of smaller states who acknowledged the suzerainty of a great king and received protection in exchange for loyalty and tribute. This hierarchy was not always clearly defined in practice, and there was constant jockeying over status. The Amarna letters include extended disputes about precedence. But the basic framework was recognized by all the major players, and it provided a shared language for managing conflict and cooperation. Marriage was the most powerful diplomatic tool in the Bronze Age toolkit. A royal marriage created a personal bond between two ruling houses that could last generations. It created obligations of mutual support. It created human connections, family connections, between courts that were otherwise separated by vast distances and cultural differences. The scale of the practice was extraordinary. Egyptian pharaohs married daughters of Mitanni kings, Babylonian kings, and Hittite kings. Sometimes multiple wives from multiple foreign courts simultaneously. The Hittite-Egyptian Treaty of Kadesh, negotiated after the famous chariot battle of roughly 1274 BC, is the most complete surviving example of Bronze Age diplomatic machinery. It covers mutual defense obligations. Each party commits to assist the other against external enemies. It covers extradition. Refugees and political dissidents who flee from one country to the other must be returned. It invokes the gods of both parties as witnesses and enforcers of its provisions. And it includes a marriage clause. Rameses II eventually married a daughter of the Hittite king as part of the diplomatic normalization. The treaty is striking not just for its content, but for its form. It exists in multiple versions: Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions on temple walls and Hittite cuneiform on clay tablets. Both versions have survived. Both versions describe the same agreement in their respective diplomatic vocabularies, with their respective gods invoked as witnesses. The Treaty of Kadesh is a demonstration that two civilizations with entirely different writing systems, languages, religions, and cultural traditions could nonetheless construct a shared framework for binding international agreement. The Bronze Age diplomatic system also developed something we might call a professional foreign service. Messengers who knew the routes, the protocols, and the expectations of foreign courts. Translators who could move between languages and cultural registers. Scribes who knew the conventions of Akkadian diplomatic correspondence well enough to produce documents that would be recognized as authentic and authoritative by recipients thousands of miles away. This was, in embryo, the professional diplomatic corps. And then the system collapsed. The Great King framework evaporated. The Hittite Great King ceased to exist. The Mycenaean Great King ceased to exist. Egypt's Great King survived but contracted, losing the capacity and the interest to maintain the kind of active international relationships they had sustained at the new kingdom's prime. The Akkadian diplomatic lingua franca fell out of use over a few generations. Without the palace courts that had maintained it, without the scribal schools that had taught it, without the diplomatic missions that had used it, Akkadian contracted back toward its homeland in Mesopotamia and eventually ceased to be a living language altogether. The international order of the Bronze Age, the first genuine international order in human history, simply stopped functioning. Not because it was defeated in war or replaced by a better system. It stopped functioning because the economic and institutional foundations that had made it possible collapsed. The lesson here is subtle but important. International order is not a natural condition. It requires active maintenance, institutions that train diplomats, shared languages for communication, economic interdependencies that give all parties an incentive to keep the system running, and a shared understanding of the rules of the game. When those foundations erode, The international order does not persist on its own. It dissolves. Modern international order, the United Nations system, the WTO, the network of bilateral and multilateral treaties that governs relations between states, rests on foundations more robust than the Bronze Age system, but not fundamentally different in kind. It rests on economic interdependencies, shared institutions, shared protocols, and a shared language for communication. English plays the role Akkadian played in the late Bronze Age. What happens to that order if the economic interdependencies fracture, if the shared institutions lose legitimacy and funding, if the shared protocols are systematically violated by major powers? The Bronze Age diplomatic system suggests that these questions deserve serious attention. International order is a human construction that requires constant maintenance. It has collapsed before. The treaty that Hittite and Egyptian kings negotiated beside the Orontes River in roughly 1274 BC lasted for about a century before the world that had made it possible ceased to exist. The diplomats who negotiated it, who pressed its provisions into clay and carved them into temple walls, believed they were building something permanent. They were building something remarkable, but not permanent. Nothing is permanent. The Bronze Age keeps reminding us of this, and we keep finding reasons not to listen.